Hello, and I'm going to do a Stripe demo for you today. The demo is going to make use of the Stripe API to take credit card information and payments through your e-commerce store. I have a simple Rails app set up, and I am going to demo the use of a payment button that looks something like this. So I have my application up and running. It's already written, so I'm not going to be live coding it for you today. I'm just going to step you through the components that were required. First, I'll demo the system for you. So here you can see a page that could be equivalent of a checkout page. Now, your checkout page would probably have a lot more information having to do with what was being purchased, taxes and whatnot. But the assumption here is this line here is equivalent to what you would have for a total. And then there's this pay to card button that actually comes with using Stripe. When I click on it, I get a pop-up here that gives me what would be a description of what was being charged. I can put my email address in, and I'll use test@example.com for that. The credit card number that you can use for testing purposes as a valid card number is 4242, repeated over and over. And as long as I put in a valid date for the expiration date, something like sometime in the future, this would work. I can also show you what would happen if we failed one of the requirements in terms of maybe providing a expired credit card. So here I have everything correct other than the credit card. I try to pay. The form sort of shakes its head no and circles the expiration. I can fix that to be a date in the future. And now the payment's going to go through. And I have my application set up to, once the payment goes through, to sort of show some debugging information about the customer object that was set up within the Stripe system and the charge object that was set up as well. Those we'll look at in a little bit more detail once we dive into the code. So that's the demo of the application in action. I used a few bits of reference material to build this app. One was the Stripe API documentation, so that's at stripe.com/docs/API, and I made sure I was on the Ruby language. There's also the Rails checkout guide, and that's available at stripe.com/docs/checkout/Rails. And that's what we're going to be using, this system that Stripe calls checkout, which is that little pop-up we saw for accepting payments on your website. I also have a GitHub repository of the code that I have demoed for you and will explain today. And so I'll link to this GitHub repository from the description of this YouTube video. And it's a fully working Rails application, so you could download it and try it out. But you can also look at the commit history, and I've tried to be quite diligent about committing very small pieces so that if you are going through the video and you want to see the exact code I added at any point. So for example, we're going to be creating a charges controller that has routes to it. You can see right here, this is where I added the charges routes for the new and the create action. You could go right to that commit and see the exact changes that were made in that. I added this line here, and I removed some existing stuff right here. Okay, so let's follow this tutorial and see where it gets us. So the getting started here is that the first thing we want to do is add the Stripe gem to our gem file. So remember that every Rails project has a gem file in its root folder. I'll just collapse some of these. So this is my project, the Stripe test application, and in the root folder I have my gem file. There's a bunch of gems that are in there already by default. That's what Rails puts in there for us. But you can see here on line 33 I've added the Stripe gem. And then what I needed to do after that point was to run bundle install from the root of my application to install the gem. So that was step one. The next thing that we're asked to do is to generate a new Rails controller called charges. And that controller is going to make use of a new and a create action. And so they recommend running Rails G controller charges, but since we already know the name of the two actions that we're going to be creating, we could instead add those two actions afterwards. So I could say new and what's it called? Create. And so that adds a little bit to what they recommended, but that'll just give us a little bit more in the controller and the views that are created for us. So inside of our charges controller, we'll get a blank new and create action, and inside of our charges view folder, we'll get a new.html.erb and a create.html.erb. And it explains here that the charges controller is going to do two things. It's going to show a credit card form that's going to be on charges new, and it's going to actually create the charges, and that's going to be the charges create. So here's some code that they provide. I can show it to you in the charges controller that I have built up here. Here is the new action, and here is the create action. I've modified things a little bit from their example. So if you look at the example, their new action is empty. And I've added two instance variables, a amount and a description. And I've done that because in their example, they have hard-coded the amount being charged right into the view. And so if we scroll down a little bit here, this is the view that handles the form for making the charges, and they've got the amount of $5 hard-coded right into the page and also hard-coded right into this script tag, as in 500 cents. And I wanted the application that we wrote to be a little more flexible. Your amount is likely coming from something like a session, or even a database table, which would be like the total charge that you're about to charge to the user. It wouldn't be something that you hard coded into a view. So what I've done is instead of making an empty new action, I've set up an amount that the charge is going to be, and Stripe expects an amount in terms of cents, because it's common practice not to use floating point numbers to represent money, because money is not something that we can allow to have floating point precision. It needs to be perfectly precise, so we need to use a whole number of cents for our dollar amounts. So here's a $5 charge, and then a place where I could put a description. And this description of charge is the message that's going to appear at the top of the pop-up that appears when the user clicks the pay button, that little pop-up where we entered our credit card. This is the message that will appear at the top of that. Now, continuing on here, they also ask us to have a create action, and this I've left pretty much the same as what Stripe recommended. The few modifications that I made were as follows. We create a customer by way of the Stripe API. So having Stripe in our gem file has given us access to a Stripe object. And here we're sort of creating a Stripe customer. The email and the source, you can see they're coming from params. So this create action is going to be posted to from the view associated with the new action. And these are things that are coming to us by way of that post. After we create a customer on the Stripe system, so this is creating a customer not in our own local database, but on the Stripe system. Over here, we are creating a charge, associating it with the customer that we just created, an amount, which again is stored in a variable. Here I just have it hard-coded into a variable. In both of these places in your application, that information would have to come from your cart, the total of your cart. A description here, this is how this charge will be described when you go and look up the payment within the Stripe website. I did change the currency to Canadian dollars. And then you can see here, this is something that we haven't seen in our exploration of Ruby before, but we have a rescue statement, and this is how Ruby deals with exceptions. So there's a chance that this charge is going to throw an exception if the credit card processing doesn't go through. This rescue statement catches that exception, turns the message returned by the exception into a error in the flash hash, redirects back to the new charges path, and then would then display that error message, credit card has been rejected or something along those lines, depending on what the problem is. So that's how the Stripe API chooses to do dealing with this, sort of the error handling, by way of a rescue block. Let's go back to the tutorial and see what else I made in terms of differences. The only other difference I made is that in the Stripe tutorials, they set up both the charge and the customer as regular variables. I turned them into instance variables because I wanted to look at those objects, sort of inspect them inside of the view to see what was sent back to us. That was just my curiosity. I wanted to know what this customer object looked like and what this charge object looked like. And so I've sort of echoed those out within the associated view, the create.html.erb. So that's another minor change I made. Back at the guide here, we can see what it asks us to do next. It says define the routes, and it has us go to our config route.rb file, and it says create resources charges. Now, if we were going to do that, it would create all 7 of the RESTful routes. So it would create a route for an index, a show, a new, a create, an update, a delete. We don't actually need all of that. The only of the 7 routes that we actually need are the new and the create. So again, I made a slight modification here. Instead of doing a full resources charges, in my routing file, which can be seen here, I've done resources charges, comma, and I've specified that I only want the routes for the new and the create action. And if we look at my routing, so if I go to my localhost /rail/info/routes, you can see those 2 routes now exist. So I have a charges path and a new charge path. The new charge path is loaded when we go to a GET request to /charges/new, and that will run the new action of the charges controller. And the create action of the charges controller will be executed when we receive a post to the charges path. Okay. Next up, we have this step here in terms of configuring our application. And it asks us to create a file called stripe.rb in the config initializers folder. Let's go look at that folder. Config initializers. All of the files in this folder, the initializers folder, are run automatically when Rails starts up. So it's where we initialize settings for the various parts of our Rails application. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that Rails does in terms of setup, in terms of that. All of these files here were created by Rails. But we've added this one here, this stripe.rb, and we've pasted in this code. We've set up a Rails configuration for Stripe, where we have defined something called a publishable key and a secret key. And we've used the secret key that we defined up here to set the API key for the Stripe class. Now, we haven't hard-coded in a publishable key and a secret key in here. Instead, we are using something called the env hash, and we're asking for publishable key and secret key. Now, what this means is that we can, if you sign up for a Stripe account, which you should do, part of your settings for your Stripe account is a publishable key and a secret key. in the tutorial here, they provide you a dummy publishable key and a dummy secret key that you can use. But it's recommended that you get your own actual keys to test this out, because then you can actually see the payments going through. We don't want to hard code these directly into our application, because we're putting all of our application files up on GitHub, and this is a secret key. It should not be something that you share on the internet, because it's basically the keys to your Stripe account, which deals with payment processing. So that's not something you want up on GitHub. So what this means here, this env, is it means that we're going to supply this information to Rails by way of a operating system environment variable. There's different ways to set up environment variables. The easiest way to get this working with Rails is that before you run your Rails server, you run two set commands. So look right here, I have a set, and I'm setting this publishable key. So I use that same all caps publishable key, and I'm using the publishable key that they provided in the tutorial. You can use the publishable key from your Stripe account. The set command sets environment variables. So I can set that, and I can also set the secret key using another set command. And again, here I'm using the provided one from the tutorial, but you would use your secret key from your account. And this way you don't have to put those keys into your version control. They can just be part of your operating system's environment variables. We've just set them there. They will clear when we close this Commander window. So they're only set for this current session of Commander, and you have to set them in this way before you call Rails server. And you have to call Rails server in the same Commander window that you set your publishable and secret key. So I'll do that now. Heading back to the guide here. We've defined our routes, we've configured our application. We need to create some views. Now, one thing they suggest here is creating a separate layout file called charges.html.erb. You could do this, but then it would make your charges page look completely different from every page within the rest of your application. So I chose not to do this, not to give like a separate layout to the views for my charges. And so I skipped that step. Then it provides us with what should be the content of the charges create view. The charges new view, that's what this should be right here, and the create view. And I made a few changes here as well, so let's go look at those. We'll start with the new. So here is my charges controller. What the new action and view are in charge of is displaying the total amount that you're about to charge the user and actually asking for the payment. So this is /charges/new, where it says amount $5, and we get this pay with card button. This is the associated action. I set an amount and I set a description as instance variables. If we look at the associated view, remember that after any action executes, if we don't redirect or render, we automatically load the associated view, which in this case is the app views charges new.html.erb file. That is this right here. Most of this was provided in the tutorial, but I've made a few changes here. The amount that I'm displaying is I'm using a Rails echo statement right here. I'm using Rails' number to currency helper to format this number as a currency, and I'm taking the amount that was set in the charges controller in cents, so 500 cents being $5, and I'm dividing it by 100 so that it's converted back into something that looks more like human readable currency, and then it's going to be formatted as a dollar amount with a dollar sign in front of it and limited to 2 decimal places. So that's just to display the message to the user, the amount, what the total amount is. So I can have this be like, you know, in your checkout, this could be your grand total. And if we go back to the application, that's this here, this grand total. Now this button here comes to us by way of this JavaScript tag. And this again is just straight up provided. It's making use of the Rails Stripe configuration that we set up in the initializer file. And I'm echoing in the description for this data description attribute. And that description comes to us by way of this controller. And I'm also going to be echoing in the amount in terms of cents over here. So in the Stripe tutorial, they had both of these things hard-coded in. That's not going to work for an application where we want to charge the customer a specific amount of money depending on how much is in their shopping cart. And so I've made it a little bit more flexible here in that we're echoing those in from instance variables. Now that's the new. When we click this pay with card, that's going to take us to the charges create action. That's right here. So that button is actually a form which posts its data to this charges create action. We don't want to rely on that post to tell us how much money we want to charge the customer, because that could be tampered with. So we are, again, setting the amount. And you would not have this hard-coded in yours. This would come from your shopping cart. And this is where we set up our Stripe customer by way of the API and our Stripe charge by way of the API using the amount and the customer. If everything goes well, we'll load up the associated view, the create.html.erv. If there's something that goes wrong in the charge, that will be handled by this rescue statement, and the user will receive that message. So let's look at what happens on success. We've gone through all of this. We've created a customer. We've created a charge. I've made both of those things instance variables. So in the create section here, it says, thanks, you paid. And again, I'm using the number to currency helper. I added this. I made this a little bit different than what was in the provided tutorial. And I'm using the charge object that the Stripe API gave us. And this is when I looked at the Stripe API. I can go to the charges section of the Stripe API, and I can see that when you get a charge response back from Stripe, it tells you how much was paid. It also tells you things like whether or not the payment was successful. And so this paid field here, if it's true, things were successful. And so I'm using the amount, dividing it again by 100 because it's going to come to us in number of cents, and then formatting it with number to currency just to say how much was paid. And then I have 2 debug statements just because I wanted to look at all of the data that was being returned by way of Stripe in terms of the customer and the charge. And then we can look up information on both the charge object that comes back to us and the customer object that comes back to us. Both of those things can be looked up on the Stripe API. And that's effectively it. So again, this is the new view where I'm displaying a cost and setting up the payment button. When I click on that, I'm asked for my payment. This description of charge text here, that's coming from the string that we set up right here. So if I change that, the description of this charge is purchase a large, or purchase of a large chair. And so if I was to go and reload this page up here, click this payment button, purchase of a large chair now becomes the description. I can put in my test email address, my test card number, a valid date in the future, and the CVC check. This will post to the charges create action. Everything works well. We get a check mark. And then we get to that charges create action where my debugging information prints out information about the customer and also the charge. And you can see things like the amount and the fact that that it was paid was equal to true. Now, one other thing that you will have to do extra in your application is it's not just good enough to charge the customer over in Stripe. You want to be able to capture that order in your backend, in your database. And so after the charge has gone through, you'd probably want to do that. Another thing you may wish to do is to be able to save information about the Stripe customer in your database as well. And so you might choose to, like if we look up some information about the customer in question here, every customer has a customer ID. That's going to be a unique ID associated with that particular customer, and you can look that customer up again in the charge system or in the Stripe system. And let's see here, customer. Trying to see which one is the actual ID because I also see a customer here. Only return charges for this customer specified by this ID. Oh yeah, there's the customer ID right there. Okay, so that customer ID, there it is. I was on the wrong section. I was at the card ID down below. This customer ID uniquely identifies your customer. You could save that into your customers table and associate a particular customer in your backend with a Stripe customer, and that would give you the ability to sort of remember information about that customer, potentially even being able to set up things like reoccurring payments. Not something you need to do for the project, but that's something you might want to do in a real life situation. What you will want to do in your project is to make sure that the charges actually went through, and if they do, to persist an order to your database, right? An order that captures what was ordered by the customer, so which products were ordered, their quantities, and you really only want to create that order if the charge was successful. And so you might have an if statement within your code that asks something like this, that it tested to see if, and again, in the API, there's two things we would probably want to check. We'd probably want to check to see if the paid attribute was true. And we might also want to verify that the amount that we received from the customer was the same as the amount we actually asked for. And that would just to be to reconcile against some kind of attack where we were actually paid less than we requested. So we could say something like if charge.amount is the same as amount and maybe I'll do the other way around. If ask paid, if charge paid and the amount was the same as the one we asked for, then you could go ahead and create an order, order.create, and for that you might need to create a number of line items from your shopping cart, associate them with the order, maybe associate the order with the current customer. As I said, you might want to persist the Stripe customer's ID, and you might also want to save the Stripe charge ID. But really the key thing is that the order should be conditionally created on success of the Stripe charge. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to show in terms of Stripe. Again, for all of this, I was using the provided testing keys that Stripe gives in their tutorial. They give them in this testing, the integration section. They give you this publishable key and this secret key. They also show you a command here which would work under a Unix or Linux environment to run the Rails server with both of these things as environment variables. But if you're running under Windows, you're going to have to do it differently. You're going to have to do it how I showed you, by running two set commands before Rails S. So a Rails set for the publishable key, a set command for the publishable key, a set command for the secret key, and then running Rails server. And you will also want to set up yourself as a Stripe customer so that you will get your own publishable key and secret key that you could use in your application. If you plan on deploying your application with Stripe integrated, you will have to look into how to get the publishable key and secret key as environment variables in your production setup as well. All right, thank you very much for watching this video, and hopefully you are able to integrate Stripe with your application. I know a number of you already have, and so I expect to see a number more people implement it before the end of the term. So all the best and good luck. Bye-bye.